clients before the Company Law Board, the NCLT, the DRT, and the Appellate Tribunal. He also has a very vast experience in the field of commercial arbitration. He expanded his arbitration practice substantially and is active in international commercial arbitrations, including some notable infrastructure and commercial disputes before the ICC Paris, as well as the Singapore International Arbitration Center. Welcome, Mr. Marari.
Thank you.
I will next go on to introduce Mr. Vyapak Desai. He heads the International Dispute Resolution and Investigation Practice at the international law firm Nishit Desai Associates. His vast experience in litigation includes representing clients as a counsel in a host of commercial cases, including investment treaty arbitrations, commercial disputes related to shareholder agreements, international trade and commercial and contractual disputes across industries, both in India and all over the world. Vyapak is also the co-chair counsel of the Mumbai Center of International Arbitration. He's the director of CIARB India branch, a convener of the India Arbitration Forum, and a member of the ICC India Group, co-chair of the Society of Construction Law India, the Western India chapter, and the advisory board at Mark Mauritius, member of the IBA, IPBA, and the Bar Council of Maharashtra and Goa. He has also been listed in the panel of arbitrators of the SIAC, AIC, LCIA, THIAC, MCX, NCDX of the SEBI, and as well as the BVI-IAC. Welcome, Vyapak, to the
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Last but not the least, Dr. Amit George, our moderator for the evening. Amit practices as an advocate before the High Court of Delhi, as well as the Supreme Court. He has appeared as an arguing counsel in various matters before various courts and statutory tribunals, resulting in reported judgments in diverse areas of law. Dr. George also frequently appears before various arbitral tribunals in ad hoc and institutional arbitrations, and with a special focus on disputes arising out of infrastructure contracts. Dr. George has also been appointed as an arbitrator on various occasions by the High Court of Delhi, the Delhi International Arbitration Center, and the Mumbai Center for International Arbitration. Welcome, Dr. Amit George. Without much ado, can I hand over the mic to Dr. Amit George to take the proceedings forward for the day?
Thank you so much, Mr. Soni. Right. We are all gathered here essentially to debate a very critical and, let's say, crucial issue relating to arbitration proceedings in the country today. As we all know, when the 2015 Amendment Act was sought to be brought into effect, one of the primary issues which it sought to address was the fact that arbitration proceedings in India, unfortunately, were very inefficient, not only in terms of the speed with which they were conducted, but also the amount of time it took to actually reach even the stage of arbitration itself with the appointment of the arbitral tribunal. So it needs no gainsaying that two of the most well-known and let's say the most ambitious provisions of the 2015 amendment pertain to amendments in Section 11 of the Arbitration Act, specifically limiting the scope of examination by the court when it would actually entertain a controversy as to whether an arbitral tribunal was required to be constituted or not. As we are all aware, the specific provision is Section 11(6)(a), which limited the scope of examination only to the examination as to whether an arbitration agreement indeed existed or not, and which was, of course, far narrower than the earlier issues which were contemplated or considered by courts on various occasions, such as limitation, accord and satisfaction, etc., which had led to a great delay and, in fact, a mini trial at the initial stage of the proceedings itself. And there are many cases where it took years to constitute arbitral tribunals because the issue was kept pending for one or the other reason. Similarly, after the arbitration tribunal has in fact taken office or been appointed, there have been many cases under the 1996 Act where arbitration proceedings have gone on for years, if not decades. Again, completely obliterating and defeating the entire purpose of going to an ADR mechanism in the first place. And therefore, we had the introduction of this new provision, Section 29A, which laid down a certain timeline for within which the arbitration proceedings had to be conducted. And it also set some sort of a, let's say, an outer limit, a Lakshman Rekha, beyond which continuation of proceedings was contingent upon an application being made before the court and consequently allowed by it. Now, both these provisions then also witnessed certain nips and tucks as represented in the 2019 amendment, where there was again a certain modulation which was sought to be done in relation to the operation of these provisions. Now, effectively, we've had both these provisions on the statute books for over 5 years now. And therefore, today we are gathered here to essentially debate and discuss as to not only the efficacy of these provisions, the result that they have engendered on the practical sphere in arbitration proceedings, but also as to the need or the efficacy of what exactly the 2019 amendment seeks to do in terms of a course correction. Whether this course correction is in fact warranted, or has it actually undone to a certain extent what is sought to be, what is perceived to be the laudable objectives of the 2015 amendment. Now, with this broad background in mind, of course, we have the perfect panel here today to debate and discuss these pertinent issues. So just to give a very brief introduction in terms of the methodology which we will be following for the session today. Effectively, as a moderator, I will be postulating certain propositions. And each of these propositions will then either be supported or opposed by our distinguished speakers. In the middle, of course, to maybe also try and find a common ground or a middle ground, and possibly also find some occasion to deliberate as to what might be a more gray area in some of these provisions. There will, of course, be let's say, a certain proposition for which I will invite both speakers to give their views without necessarily taking an adversarial position against each other. Now, therefore, with this brief background in mind, if the speakers permit, then I may continue on to the substantive portion of the session today. Right. So, Mr. Desai, Mr.
Sure.
Raghavan, with your permission, I'll continue.
Please.
Right. So I think the first thing which we need to, I guess, talk about today is as to how exactly Section 29A has actually proved itself on the ground level. Now, the proposition, therefore, which we will start out with is, has Section 29A contributed to true efficiency in the conduct of arbitration proceedings, or has it been reduced to a mere paper tiger, or even worse, has it sacrificed the quality of arbitration proceedings at the altar of speed? Now, speaking in favor of the motion, supporting the introduction of Section 29A will be Mr. Desai. And I request Mr. Desai to take the stage and speak in favor of the motion.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Amit, and thank you, Just Act and FIDR, to host this session. I think, as Amit rightly said, it's already 5 years since we have seen these provisions in action. Of course, both these provisions have undergone some change in 2019, so we will debate those aspects a little later. But I think one thing which is to be kept in mind is at least the first portion of the discussion and the first question which Amit you have asked. I'm confining myself to the amendment which was brought in 2015 and not dealing with the amendments which happened to Section 29A in 2019. Let's take where we were in 2015, right? It's not very common that I have this clear ground when Mr. Murari is already there. So I think thanks, Amit, for giving me this first opportunity. I think it makes my job a little easier. But basically where we were in 2015, right? I think everyone was looking at India while we had our Arbitration and Conciliation Act based on the unilateral model right in 1996. So frankly speaking, right from 1996, we were very much, at par with any other, jurisdiction, whether it is, UK, Singapore, or any other pro-arbitration jurisdiction. India did adopt the new Arbitration and Conciliation Act in 1996 itself, which in my view was a great step towards bringing an alternate dispute resolution at par with any other litigation proceedings. What happened then till almost 2012, till Balco came in, was the kind of interpretation which happened with regard to the law obviously took India several steps back from where it was in 1996. I think it is also accepted and well recognized that some of those judgments, did not appreciate the objective and the intent under which the 1996 Act was formulated. People started talking that, look, this is not even an alternate dispute resolution. This is both the ease which are required for an alternate dispute resolution, which is efficiency and effectiveness, both are missing. The time taken to even start an arbitration is longer than what other jurisdictions claim, to finish the arbitration. And delay was something, for various reasons, was something which was, biting the international community with regard to the alternate dispute resolution. With almost, 3 crore cases pending in different courts, I think commercial agreements had no choice but to have an arbitration. But then coming to arbitration was also a problem. So in my view, in that context, introduction of 29A was an excellent, step. I think India gave a very, very strong message to the international world that, look, delay is not something which is going to be tolerated so far as arbitration is concerned. There were always, this, in a lighter note, people saying that, look, arbitration does not work in India because of, either the arbitrators themselves, because matters don't get proceeded, or the courts, which would possibly interfere with good or bad intentions. But this 29A brought a great, jerk to those negativism. I think it made India look very, very strong. It made India look very, very, I would say, positive in the eyes of the international jurisdictions. And no jurisdiction could claim that, you have a statute which asks you to finish your arbitration in 12 to 18 months. Otherwise, you'll have to explain to the court why you need more time. Now, this provision was obviously debated and discussed at various forums on several counts, that this won't work for complex arbitrations, this won't work for heavy matters, it won't work in an Indian condition. But my personal experience, and I have heard a lot of people before 2019 amendments came in, that it was actually working on the ground. And to be very frank, what do other institutions also say, right? Other institutions in international jurisdictions also say that, and on an average, their arbitrations get over within 18 months to 24 months. So what is wrong to have a statute with that, provision? And in India, I think nothing works unless you have some real, provision which requires people to act in a particular fashion. Otherwise, everything, there is a difference between what is important and what is urgent. And people forget, to discuss what is important and keep discussing what is urgent, and, forget that, ultimately what you have to decide is the issue under consideration rather than the peripheral issues. So my first point to start with is that 29A was an excellent move, and it actually worked so far as India as a jurisdiction and India as a seat of arbitration is concerned. I would let Mr. Murari give his point of view on this, and then we can take it forward.
Thank you, Mr. Vyapak. As you all know, Mr. Vyapak is always a very hard act to follow. And when he batted first, it makes my task so much tougher to meet the substantial points he has made. And like he pointed out, And like Amit also pointed out, there's no black and white here. There are several shades of gray. And therefore, while I agree with Mr. Vyapak up to a point, I must I must join issue with him on several other issues which came about as a result of the 2015 amendment. Of course, we will debate separately the effect of the 2019 amendment. Let me circle back a little bit. If you look at the 1940 Act, it had a time limit for arbitrations. That's one of the implied terms of every arbitration agreement, was that there would be a time limit for the arbitration. It never worked. There was also a provision there which said, if you don't finish that arbitration within the time limit, you go to court. Now, I agree that 1950 was a bit of a mess because the scope of the arbitration and scope of the challenge was so vast. And the speed of arbitration, which was a very nascent stage, was also slow. As a result, most arbitrations ended up in court. And what would happen is that the very arbitration would get held up till the court decided, and this is not a priority item for a court, till the court decided to extend time for the arbitration. And that is why 1996 Act was first formulated. It did not fix the time limit because it faced the difficulty of fixing an artificial time limit and driving all parties to court. Now, therefore, from 1996, there was no time. I'm not saying it worked perfectly. There was certainly fetters in the working because once you have an open-ended arbitration act in that sense, you tend to drag it. Nothing prevented the parties from fixing a time limit in an arbitration agreement and adhering to it. But parties chose not to do it. Parties chose to take the easy route of not having a time limit, and therefore arbitration stretched. I concede that point, that 1996 didn't work well for this reason. But the fact is that by introducing a time limit, that is in the 2015 amendment, the section 29A, and again, there's a lot of debate about whether the time limit of 12 months was in fact adequate. You introduced that time limit, you gave the arbitrators another 6 months to extend that time limit, and beyond that, they had to go to court. There was no choice at all. Now, the difference between domestic arbitrations here in India and any international commercial arbitration or any large institutional arbitration is only this, that I would believe, I don't have the exact statistics, but I would believe that anywhere between 86 to 90% of domestic arbitrations are ad hoc arbitrations. They are not institutional arbitrations. Now, in this ad hoc arbitrations, you don't have a time limit fixed by the institution. Neither are you governed by the institution which asks you to comply with sub-limits for pleadings, etc., etc. So in the absence of that, fixing a 12-month time limit overall from the date they entered upon the reference was in fact asking too much. Keeping in mind this fact, the arbitrations are ad hoc. Most arbitrators were retired judges who were extremely busy, and therefore could give dates maybe in 2 months or 3 months for the next hearing, after completion of pleadings, which took anywhere between 3 months to 6 months. I'm not saying it's applicable to all. If it was small hire purchase arbitration, maybe pleadings would be over in a month. But if you look at any large domestic arbitration, especially where the government is involved, you will find that pleadings extend to anywhere between 4 to 6 months. And if counterclaims are involved, it will stretch for that much longer. So out of a 12-month limit, which 2015 Act specified, about 6 to 7 months are used up in just completion of pleadings. Now you get into the actual arbitration, which starts from issues, all of it, because like Mr. Vyapak said, and I fully agree with him on this, that arbitrations were not treated as arbitrations, but as an extension of a civil suit. It was run just like a civil suit. You had the whole gamut of pleadings, issues, admission, denial of documents, discovery, inspection, all of it. And that ran its own course, and then you started oral evidence. Oral evidence was also not restricted to the specific aspects for which oral evidence ought to be let, but for just about every other aspect. And therefore, all of these ran its course. And all of a sudden, you find that 12 months was used up in all of this. The arbitrators were running out of time. They could extend time for only 6 months, by which time not only did they have to complete the hearing, but they also had to pass an award. And therefore, you would find that there was a plethora of applications under Section 29A filed before courts saying please extend time. Now, courts again have their own priorities, they have their own compulsions, and nobody was clear at that point of time whether the arbitration could proceed when the time limit had run out and an application is pending. So therefore, what happened is this fixation of 12-month limit, and I'm specifying this, I'm not saying I'm not against the fixation of a time limit at all. I feel that there has to be a time limit fixed in the context of the ad hoc arbitration especially, but this 12-month time limit, which Section 29A provided for, is, in my opinion, totally unrealistic, because keeping in mind the complexities of some arbitrations and this one shoe fits all concept, time did not work. Therefore, my opinion is that while the fixation of a time limit is essential, it's required, this fixation in terms of 29A did not actually meet the requirements, which is borne out by the number of court proceedings. And while we're looking at what institutions fix, which is 12 months to 24 months, those arbitrations are governed by the institutions who intervene at every point of time and try to enforce certain discipline among the parties, which is not there in ad hoc arbitrations. And please remember this, that not all arbitrations are run by ex-judges, retired judges who are arbitrators. There are also technical arbitrators. Parties tend to take further latitude as far as they're concerned. Sometimes they're unfamiliar with the procedure, and therefore these things tend to proceed. And therefore, to conclude, and I'll pass the baton back to Amit, that time is good, but 12 months is unrealistic. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you to both the speakers. I think now we have a very stark demarcation of what are essentially the arguments in terms of the pros and cons of the provision. Now, moving beyond what is essentially, say, the adversarial position in relation to this, my question to both speakers in the manner of a deliberative sort of an exercise is that let's leave aside the question of whether this provision is essentially required to be scrapped completely or to be retained as it is, and move beyond that and go to the realm of maybe some sort of a via media. So what I have in mind is that considering the fact that party autonomy has been recognized to be so important in terms of arbitration proceedings, can we not find a middle way by possibly permitting the parties to mutually agree for an enlarged period, even beyond the 18-month or the 24-month period, which might be permitted right now, and actually say agreed to say a 3-year period or a 4-year period once disputes have arisen between the parties. Now, one sees some sort of a precedent for this in terms of the proviso to Section 12, subsection 5 of the Arbitration Act, where independence and impartiality requirements, which are otherwise, let's say, sacred, are also permitted to be derogated from if both parties agree after a dispute has arisen between them. So is it not feasible to have a somewhat similar option available to parties when, in the case of extremely complicated or extremely time-consuming arbitrations, parties may mutually agree to give a go-by to the statutory mandate and, let's say, agree to a larger time within which to, let's say, conclude the proceedings? So what are your views on that, if we may start with Mr. Desai?
Sure. I think there are quite a few good statements made by Mr. Murari, but I think some of them have a basic flaw. And let me take one by one and also address this question. First of all, I think we all agree, and as Mr. Murari also agrees, there was a huge problem of delays for arbitration. And if arbitration can't address that point vis-a-vis courts, then there is no need for an alternate dispute resolution. People were started to talk about alternate dispute resolution, which was basically fight amongst yourselves outside the court, outside the arbitration, and find a way out, right? It was a serious disease and it required a complex surgery like that, right? I think what is required from a statute, from a state responsibility perspective, is to provide a direction And if you see even the Commercial Courts Act, the case management system which it suggests, if you really count, it actually concludes a suit within 16 to 18 months. So actually speaking, it is not unheard of to look at any dispute, however complex it is, if there is a discipline brought in. And it's a question of culture and mindset. And sometimes it requires some kind of a steak approach to start with. And once it gets into culture, I think we can always ease out. But I think the ad hocism, so far as the arbitration was concerned, obviously was a very, very serious disease. And if we cannot fix it one way or the other, then it was creating a problem in overall economy. Now, when you say, can we give this autonomy to the parties? Yes, you can give the autonomy to parties. There is nothing which stops even today for the parties to go to court and ask for an extra time. I think where we are missing the point, okay, is two aspects. First, we are using the example of complex arbitrations, which are, we will possibly all agree that they are 5 to 10% of the total disputes that we are talking about, and applying it to the other 90% disputes which languish in courts and arbitrations for decades together. I don't think we can use that as a shield to just not act, right? So yes, there may be situation where there can be an exceptions to complex disputes, and there can be a provision where parties can go to court for an extension. But as a rule, giving this a free flow to the parties or to the arbitrators is not a good idea. That's my first point. Second, I think it's not that I quoted this statement, or this is what I heard in one of the in early 2000 in some conference, and I'm just using that statement. Is it was very popular to say at that point in time that, look, arbitration has failed in India because of two reasons. One is the retired judges, and the second is the existing judges. Now we can keep using this phrase, but what is required is not to just blame that system. It was required to bring in some discipline where they also get some kind of statutory right to say that, look, enough is enough. You cannot keep asking for time. I also have to, I am also as an arbitrator answerable so far as the statutory limit is concerned. And look, so far as complexity is concerned, we can look at it from an extension perspective, but there has to be a reason why it cannot be completed within 18 months. And the second point is, we are again using a shield of the term international commercial arbitrations just as a matter of fact, rather than looking at it from a perspective of what they are. They are just any other arbitration where one of the parties is non-Indian. That doesn't mean they are always complex. That doesn't mean they are always high value. I think what is required is to change the mindset from ad hoc to institutional. So in my view, if arbitration is a cake and we have to cut it in two pieces, I think the way we are trying to cut that cake is domestic arbitration and international commercial arbitration, which is a completely wrong approach. I would cut the cake in two different buckets: ad hoc arbitrations and institutional arbitrations. In my view, that will solve each and every problem that we are facing today. Make sure you have court assistance and court support so far as ad hoc arbitrations are concerned, because that is where you basically lose control on what parties can do, what arbitrators can do, what is the quality of the arbitration, and how this whole regime would work. And in India, you cannot ignore the ad hoc system. So far as institutional arbitration is concerned, I think you can easily give a lot of leeway so far as the institutions is concerned and the institutional arbitration is concerned. So my suggestion is, if you want to really have complex arbitrations, high value disputes, you are sophisticated parties, choose an institutional arbitration. You are free. You have a lot of autonomy to use those rules and conclude your arbitrations. But if you want to choose for an ad hoc arbitration, then you better follow the discipline to ensure that you finish these things in 18 to 24 months, and that's it. If you want to extend, then you better give plausible and effective reasons. Otherwise, face the consequence. So I think my clear suggestion is, one thing which requires to change is this whole difference between domestic and international commercial to ad hoc and institutional. In my view, all the problems would be solved. Over to you, Mr. Murari.
Yeah, Mr. Murari, your counter view on that then?
Yeah. No, since you started by saying this is an open-ended issue which we need to discuss, I find it very difficult to disagree with most of what Mr. Vyapak has said. In fact, I'm in agreement with almost everything that he has said except this. And before I get to the except thing, I'll point out what I fully agree, that the distinction should not be international commercial versus domestic, as Section 29A has sought to do. 29A fixes a time limit for a domestic arbitration, says international commercial, you may endeavor to finish it within the 12-month period or whatever. You made that vast distinction, which I feel is probably not correct. I mean, you should have had a time fixed for a domestic arbitration, which is ad hoc, and a time for an institutional arbitration, which goes by the time fixed by the institution. So this artificial distinction which has been created, I agree, is probably not the best solution. But coming to this party autonomy and agreeing on it, the agreement has to take place at the time of entering the agreement. Like Mr. Vyapak said, and I fully agree with this, when you enter into an agreement, complex or otherwise, please submit yourselves to the rules of an institution. When you're entering into this agreement, saying I will be bound by the rules of the Delhi International Arbitration Center or the Mumbai International Arbitration Center or any other arbitration center of your choice. In which case, then you go by the rules, you go by the time fixed by the rules, etc., etc. Because once disputes arise, and these disputes are usually acrimonious, getting parties even to agree on the name of an arbitrator is impossible, let alone on the time in which they will conclude these arbitration proceedings. Expecting both parties to agree at a time, especially if you're a respondent and your intent is to somehow delay this arbitration to make sure the claimant does not receive his money, you're not going to agree on a time limit within which we will finish this arbitration. So this party autonomy may not work unless this is done at the stage of entering into the agreement and you submit yourselves to particular rules. Now, the analogy to Section 12 may not be actually may not be the right example for this reason, that we don't need the agreement of parties under Section 12. Section 12 is a right which a party acquires, which unilaterally and voluntarily waives, namely the right to accept an arbitrator who's otherwise disqualified. So that's entirely within the discretion of one party. He may waive the requirement, he may not waive the requirement. But at that point of time, an agreement on time is very, very unlikely to happen. At least in my experience, I found that even the name of an arbitrator is hotly contested. Time is not going to be agreed. That will be that's the limited extent to which I differ from what Mr. Vyapak has said.
Right. Thank you. So I think on a related note, insofar as these positions are quite stark, I had a follow-up question. So now if one sees one of the, if I may call it slight modifications or slight leeways, which the 2019 amendment has brought about, is that under 29A subsection 4, there is now a 6-month additional period provided for completion of pleadings. Now, it's not very clear if this 6-month period is directory or mandatory in the sense as to whether the tribunal can actually extend this time beyond the 6-month period. Now, therefore, the question arises, is this amendment something which is practical, which is something which has essentially taken into account practical considerations and therefore tried to make 29A more holistic and appropriate for the Indian context, or is it actually a reflection of a backtracking from the, let's say, more strict timeline put in place by the 2015 amendment? So I would request Mr. Murari to essentially speak on why he would support the 2019 amendment in terms of the further extension it grants to the period within which the process can actually be completed. Yes, sir. Murari, sir.
Thank you. Yes, as far as the 2019 amendment is concerned, what it has done is push back everything by 6 months. It is giving you a further 6 months because you get 6 months for the completion of pleadings, after which you get 12 months for the arbitration with another 6 months extension, then you go to court. Now, as a pure arbitration practitioner, I feel that this extends an arbitration proceeding and therefore is not warranted. But we'll have to look more, not just at what the arbitration practitioner would like, but as what is feasible and practical in the circumstances. Now, to answer this question, one has to go back to Section 23 of the Arbitration Act, because that has also been consequently amended to take care of this. And this is what it says. Within the period of time agreed upon by the parties, etc., agreed upon by the parties or determined by the arbitral tribunal, you set out your statement of claim, statement of defense, etc. What has been added is 23(4), which says statement of claim and defense shall be completed within the period 6 months from the date the arbitrators receive notice. So this is the new amendment. So if you look at it, either the parties can agree on the time for completion of pleadings, or the arbitrators can fix a time for completion of pleadings, and all of it should be completed within 6 months. What is not clear in this amendment is this: if the arbitrators have fixed a period of less than 6 months, then would that prevail over Section 23(4), which says you have to do it within 6 months? That is a gray area, because if you look at it, other sections of the Arbitration Act says unless otherwise agreed by the parties. Now here as well, there is a provision for parties otherwise agreed. There's a provision for arbitrators otherwise fixing. But when it comes to 23(4), it doesn't refer to any of that, and only says you shall complete the pleadings within 6 months. So ideally, if this section is to be read in the context of expediting and being beneficial to arbitration proceedings, 23(4) should be made subject to 23(1), where the tribunal may fix a shorter time. Because I will agree with Mr. Vyapak on this, that we can't look at every arbitration as being a complex arbitration requiring 6 months to complete the pleadings. At the first hearing of the arbitration, the arbitrators are made known of what the dispute really is, and they may fix a month or 2 months for completion of pleadings in respect of what is really a non-complex dispute. In that case, then 29A will be 12 months from that completion of pleadings which the arbitrators fix, and not necessarily 6 months as provided for in Section 23(4). And that is how the 2019 amendment ought to be. Now, I would support this extension of time, not necessarily for 6 months, but for a time which the arbitrators may fix or for which the parties may agree, because one of the things that really takes up time in arbitration is the completion of pleadings. And like I said, especially when the government is involved, for whatever reason, I'm not finding fault with anyone. I'm just saying that as a matter of fact, that does take some time. Now, if a time is fixed, keeping in mind the complexity of the case, with this caveat that if you're not filed it within time, you have lost the right to file a pleading, then 29A as amended in 2019 is a very, it will have a salutary effect, because it excludes that time and still gives you 12 months to conclude. The arbitrators can extend for another 6 months, may not extend, depending if they find that the party is unnecessarily delaying it, don't extend it. That's entirely within the discretion of the arbitrators. But at each point of time, driving you to court for an extension one other very beneficial aspect of the 2019 amendment is the introduction of a proviso which says that if an application is made to court for extension of time, it doesn't mean the arbitration comes to a standstill. The arbitration will still continue, because otherwise what a party will do is delay matters, drive you to court and say, till you go and get a court order, the whole thing comes to a standstill. So the arbitration will proceed. It doesn't come to a standstill. If the court refuses to extend time, that's the constant termination of arbitration proceedings. But then by this process, you don't lose time by having to go to court. So therefore, I am for the 2019 amendment as opposed to the 2015 amendment. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, respond to Mr. Murari on this, I think my one word response to 2019 amendment is disaster. Full stop. I think we don't need, frankly speaking, complex rules for simple arbitrations. We need simple rules for complex arbitrations, right? We are actually turning the head upside down. What could have been the simplest way to address the concerns? You have complicated it so much that now you even don't know what this 6 months for pleadings would take, who can extend, who cannot extend, what pleadings are not completed within 6 months, what happens to the other 18 months. There is so much of complexities created in the arbitration rules that forget the complexities in the arbitration merits. You are actually debating the rules more than the merits of the case. Again, I think my simple solution to 29A could have been, right, and I completely oppose the way the 29A is amended in 2019. I think the simple solution, in my view, are two statements. First statement, again, I'm going back to the aspect of ad hoc versus institutional. I think by saying that the timeline will not apply to international commercial arbitration is a wrong move. So long as they are ad hoc, whether seated in India or outside, doesn't matter. So long as international commercial arbitrations are ad hoc and seated in India, the timeline should apply. Only for institutional arbitrations, you could have given a certain leeway so far as timelines are concerned. So that's my first statement. Don't slice the cake between domestic and international commercial arbitration. Slice the cake between ad hoc and institutional. Second, if there was so much of a UN cry that you cannot finish in 18 months, you need 24 months, and therefore grant 6 months for pleadings. The first argument in the earlier question was there is so much of party autonomy, there is so much of autonomy to arbitrators. Now you are fixing 6 months for pleadings. Frankly, it defeats the very purpose. If you really wanted that additional 6 months, you could have simply changed the connotation or the thresholds for 12 plus 6 months to 18 plus 6 months, and leave it to the parties and the arbitrators to choose that which arbitration requires 6 months for pleadings, which arbitrations require 3 months for pleadings, and rest of the 18 months for trial, and whatever that you may want to deal with. But at the end of the day, either you have 12 plus 6 months or you have 18 plus 6 months, that is maximum 24 months to finish the arbitration. What I'm saying is, make the rules simple to deal with complex arbitrations, rather than make the rules complex to deal with simple arbitrations. I think the time has come that we, of course, it's a great thing to see that immediately after 2015 amendments, we came up with 2019 amendments. Not in last 25 years after 1996 that we have done this to any other law, that we have come with such a freshness to the aspects of looking at dispute resolution. But that overzealous attitude need not be, an aspect that which is actually complicating the way the arbitrations work. So my simple answer to that is 29A as amended in 2019 is a completely wrong move. It could have been easily taken care of by the two suggestions that I have made. Thank you.
Right. So I think we've had a very detailed sort of discussion on basically almost every single aspect of 29A in terms of whether it is actually a laudable provision, or has it actually, let's say, gridlocked or straight-jacketed us too much in terms of the conduct of the arbitration proceedings. So ultimately, both speakers have postulated their respective viewpoints, and forcefully so. And therefore, ultimately, I guess it is a question which all of us need to debate internally as well, in terms of how we contemplate arbitration to be, and how important is that flexibility as opposed to, let's say, an untrammeled discretion, which can also be available to a tribunal in terms of the conduct of the proceedings. So I thank both speakers for having led us through what is essentially the pros and cons of the approach which has been embodied in the statute today. And therefore, this gives us fertile ground for possibly what can be the way forward in the future. Now, therefore, moving on to the second arena which we wanted to discuss and debate today, which is in relation to the scope of Section 11. Now, the primary question which will obviously arise is, just as in the case of 29A, as to whether the decision to limit the examination to the existence of an arbitration agreement alone in terms of Section 11(6)(a) has actually had the desired impact in terms of narrowing the scope of adjudication, and therefore resulting in a quicker decision and a quicker constitution of the arbitral tribunal. A related question obviously is that the 2019 Amendment Act, quite perplexingly, seems to delete Section 11(6)(a) in its entirety. Now, of course, this provision is yet to be notified, but it is something obviously which is in the offing sooner than later. Now, therefore, a related question is that if there is a complete absence of 11(6)(a), wouldn't we actually be going back to square one in terms of giving the courts untrammeled discretion in terms of determining any and sundry issue when it comes to appointment of an arbitral tribunal? Now, therefore, for this very interesting issue, I would request Mr. Murari, who would actually be supporting the deletion of 11(6)(a) by the 2019 amendment, to come forward and speak as to why he believes this is the right course of action, and why we should not have 11(6)(a) in the Arbitration Act, and then obviously also to touch upon his experiences in terms of the kind of impact it has had as on date. Mr. Murari, sir, over to you.
Let me add a small modification to what you said. Whether 11(6)(a) has had the impact of expediting the court process. Maybe it has, but that is only one segment of it. Has it had the impact of expediting the entire arbitral process, starting from the appointment of an arbitrator to the award and the challenge? This is a question which we need to ask ourselves in the context of 11(6)(a) as it stands now. Now, let me again circle back a little bit to go back to the origins of Section 11, because we are looking at, and as Mr. Vyapak said, this is an act which is started in from 1940 to 96 Act. We had just one act. 96 Act came into force. We've been debating this ever since. We've had this 2015 amendment. We've had the 2019 amendment. We've been unhappy with all of these amendments, and we probably look at the 2021 amendment as well, which I think is not a great idea, because we're going a lot of back and forth on arbitration, which is not good to the institution of arbitration as such. But having said that, as far as this specific aspect is concerned, 11(6)(a), I do support the deletion for this reason. Now, let's circle back a little bit. 11(6), as it originally stood, was a reference made to the Chief Justice for his decision. You apply to the Chief Justice for a decision. Konkan Railway says it's an administrative decision, which held this way for quite some time. Then you had Patel Engineering, which changed it and said it is a judicial decision because it's by a court. The Chief Justice is acting judicially. And these are the parameters which he is discussing. In fact, they came across, also looked at this position of the fact that he can delegate his power to another judge, not to an arbitral institution, which is not a judicial body. And they've set out the parameters which a Chief Justice or a court could do while deciding to make a reference to arbitration. Now, this was thought to be too wide, and for several reasons, because one of those issues was a live claim. For a live claim, you would have to examine two aspects, whether it's barred by limitation and whether there has been a full and final settlement, all of which would have to be gone into by a Chief Justice or a court. Then you got Bogart Polyfab, which set out three sets of issues. The first, which the court should decide. The second, which the court may decide. And the third, which the court should not decide. Now, this again created a lot of confusion. But the 2000, when Section 6A was introduced, what they said was, you confine yourself only to the existence of an arbitration agreement. Now, that narrows down substantially the work of a court. Maybe it makes the work of the court substantially lesser, because all that the court is seeing, and basically it's acting again administratively, this judicial discretion is gone. You're administratively looking at whether an arbitration agreement exists. You're not seeing whether the disputes fall within the scope of that arbitration agreement, whether the disputes are so outlandish that a reference to arbitration is completely misconceived, where it's hopelessly barred by limitation, none of it. All you're doing is you're looking at the existence of an arbitration agreement and sending everything else to arbitration. What happens if Martin have an excellent case at the stage of Section 11 gets pushed to the arbitration? Arbitrations are both time-consuming and expensive. And I stress on the word expensive. It's very expensive. And therefore, you're pushing parties to an expensive course of alternate dispute when even at the outset, the whole thing could have been closed and ought to have been closed. So 11.6a, in my view, considerably, in fact, it artificially constricts the scope of inquiry by a court. The question I ask myself is this: along with Section 11, Section 8 was also amended, which again talks of a court's inquiry. Here, a decision on by a court on the existence is final. There can be no further issue on that, but that's where it's. When you go to Section 11, Section 8, the court makes a prima facie decision on whether there is a valid arbitration agreement in existence. So therefore, the scope of the inquiry under Section 8 is twofold: existence of an arbitration agreement, validity of an arbitration agreement, and both of these are prima facie, which means that they would fall for the final decision of the arbitrator justice. Now, there was no reason why, if you thought an existence of an arbitration agreement is something court can decide, like Section 8, why can't the court decide even the validity of an arbitration agreement and issues which are on the face of it visible and which the court feels is not a matter which should go to arbitration at all? So that, in my view, is a curtailment of the scope of the inquiry by Chief Justice. Now, let me come to the other aspect of the 2019 amendment, which opens up a separate bucket altogether. Because what is happening now in the 2019 amendment, not only is Section 6A deleted, but an arbitral institution is entrusted with the duty of appointing an arbitrator. What the court ought to have done is now being done by an arbitral institution. But you've taken away this the scope of inquiry of Section 11.6a. So the question that follows is, what is this arbitral institution to go into while appointing an arbitrator? There's no rule for it. Now, let me assume that there are 10 arbitral institutions which are enrolled and registered, which are recognized for the purpose of making this appointment. Each has its own rule for making an appointment. Would it mean that each institution would make its own rule and would go by its own rule? or will there be a master rule by which every institution should go by? Now, every institution, these institutions are not judicial bodies. They're not manned by judicial persons. They are people who may have legal qualifications, but that's may not also be an essential requirement. So when they actually make an appointment, does one expect them to go into the aspects of validity, life claim, etc.? Are we going back to S.P. Patel and asking this institution now to look at all of it? Which is not clear, which the 2019 amendment does not point out. So coming back to it, to conclude, I can only say this: restricting a court only to existence was always very narrow. It should have been made broader, probably not as broad as S.P. Patel, but at least some requirements. Secondly, when you took that out, you did not take care to say what would be the scope of inquiry by an arbitral institution, which now stands substituted for courts. So that will be mine.
Yeah, thank you. So if I may understand the full argument, and of course a very long argument on this, in a nutshell, right, is because arbitration process is very expensive, you need to at the threshold decide whether it exists or not. I think it is, and that's the reason why you need an expanded scope of section 11. I think, to use an analogy in a medical terms, I think it's like you have a headache, you give a medicine for stomachache and expect that so long as I've given the medicine, all the problems will get solved. I think if arbitration is expensive and people are making frivolous applications or frivolous arbitrations, the answer is cost follow event, losers pay, and that has to be enforced to avoid such frivolous invocation of arbitrations. To complicate appointment of arbitrators for that, again, in my view, one word: disaster. It's not that people in other jurisdictions don't challenge arbitrations. They also go to courts, and their provisions with regard to challenge are possibly the same language, same English language that we use. Question is, if a person loses, there is a deterrent of taking the cost on their head, and that's the reason why people don't do frivolous invocation of arbitrations, and that's the solution. Second, I think we are now in the most unique situation so far as India is concerned, so far as arbitration regime is there. And I tell you why. We have several different arbitration regimes running for the same arbitration, and frankly, nobody knows what applies to which arbitration. Just to give an illustration, there are still arbitrations which are run pre-BALCO era, where BALCO says it will only apply post-September 2012. And therefore, there are arbitrations which still follow Venture Global. Then came 2015 amendments, and then it changed the course of action. But then again, there was a distinction as to when 2015 amendment will apply, from the date of invocation of arbitration or when it goes to court. There was a judicial order which again got amended in 2019. So there is, third or the fourth regime which applies to several different provisions. In the context of section 11, right, we had a regime which worked till SPB Patel Engineering, which expanded the scope from administrative to judicial. Then there were changes where it was an application to Chief Justice. It changed to High Courts and Supreme Court. And now there is a 2019 amendment, which is yet to be notified. So people don't know when it will get notified, but it now gives the powers to an institution which is yet to be notified under the Arbitration Council of India regime. So again, we are trying to give, several different regimes to a very simple issue, which is, appointment of arbitrator and the arbitration starting. Only concern there is that, look, there should not be a complete disarray where people just invoke arbitration where there is none agreement which exists, right? And which, in my view, the 2015 amendment did what it could have done. Then to interpret the word examination and then expanding the scope of that examination and then giving another 3 different parameters, what it should and what it may and what it won't, examine under section 11, in my view, was again not necessary. The principle of competence is very clear so far as arbitration regime is concerned. Everything related to jurisdiction can always go to the arbitrator. What it requires is a prima facie review of an arbitration invocation as to whether such an arbitration exists. In fact, if you see institutional rules, whether it is Singapore International Arbitration Center, whether it is ICC, or whether it is our own MCIA or NPAC and others, it simply says that the court or the council at the institution who looks at the administration of cases in the institution have to look at it from a prima facie basis that such an arbitration may exist. The word is may exist. It doesn't have to go any further than that. Everything else the arbitrator can decide, and then cost follow event concept would take care of any expensive defense which has been taken to again bring back people to court rather than arbitration. Third and the last point, I think we need to get out of this mindset that this is an alternate dispute resolution. I think this is an parallel dispute resolution. Either you choose courts or you choose arbitration. Using the term alternate means that you are still, below par or something which is alternate to the main process, which is courts. That's not what it means. It only means that it is a parallel dispute resolution. To the extent possible, courts are required to support that process rather than intervene into that process. So my suggestion is, while the way 6A was introduced in 2015, let it stay. Even under the 2019 regime, where institutions are looking at the appointment rules, only guidance that institutions need is that they have to look into the existence of the arbitration rather than deleting that provisions. Just say they may look at it from a perspective that such arbitration may exist, and let the other issues be dealt by the arbitrator, which is what parties have negotiated for, rather than going back to the court where court investigates into it as if it is the first instance court and not a parallel arbitration regime which parties have chosen. So my take on this is, while 2015 amendment were fine, 2019 amendment again, takes away the whole objective of arbitration. In a way, in my view, the whole 2019 amendment needs to be scrapped. There is nothing much which that amendments bring in, whether it is this section or that section. And we can, again, in my view, in next 3 years, we would be debating some of these provisions as to in what context and which arbitrations it would apply, and which court proceedings it would apply. So again, make it simple. Don't try and tweak these rules too often. Certainty and predictability is key for any arbitration regime, and let's stick to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to the speakers. So one thing which I can possibly take away from the debate we just had on 11.6a is that we must now reckon with this very real possibility that once the amendments to section 11 are notified, then we will be making a significant shift in terms of the regime for arbitration in India to a completely institutional arbitration based model. Because the contemplated amendment under section 11 not only makes most arbitration susceptible to, let's say, being conducted under the aegis of an arbitration institution, but it also shifts the power for appointment of arbitrators under Section 11 from the Supreme Court and the High Courts respectively to arbitration institutions. So I think one element which requires significant debate is as to whether we have that sufficient infrastructure or ecosystem in place to actually vest these kind of wide-ranging powers with arbitration institutions on a pan-India basis. This is obviously a very vexed issue, and I would request Mr. Murari to offer his thoughts on this. Are we actually in a position to today implement this shift?
Amit, before I answer your question, I'd like to make one point. In fact, it's not clear, so I would look forward to any inputs that Mr. Vyapak has as well as you have on this, because what this talks about is Section 11, the arbitral institution making the appointment. Now, what happens after that? Are you bound by the rules of that institution for the entire conduct of the arbitration proceedings? Or is that institution's role confined only to appointment? Thereafter, you go ad hoc or whichever way you want, is not clear. But if you look at the section as it stands, it looks as if they come into the stage only of the appointment and nothing further. So if you're looking at the section as it stands, then you need to understand whether you have robust institutions which are capable of making that appointment, not necessarily of running the full arbitration. If, on the other hand, the thinking is that if an institution makes an appointment, it will also run that arbitration, then of course you're looking at a whole game altogether. But so therefore we need to consider this from both these perspectives. Now, if you look at, if you take the first aspect that the institution will only make the appointment, then you need to look at the capability of the institution to look at whatever they need to look at. If, as Mr. Vyapak says, and I would support him to that limited extent, that if you're sending it to institution, then you need to give the institution very limited powers, because they can't expand beyond their powers. So do they have the capacity to look at that powers? Let's say the existence of an arbitration agreement. So do we have an institution which is capable of doing that? The simple thing is this: if you're a registered and recognized institution, maybe today you may not have it because that's not what all institutions are doing. Because generally what you find is courts are making the appointment, referring you to an institution and saying you will do the arbitration as per the rules of that institution. Now, those are working very well, which means that you do have institutions which are capable of running that arbitration and managing that arbitration. They're working well, and the courts are making that appointment. Do they have the wherewithal to get that and make the appointment? Possibly they don't at this stage, but you're looking at the future and you're looking at institutions to ramp up to meet that requirement. I'll only draw an analogy to the IBC proceedings, where the concept of an official liquidator attached to the High Court is gone, and you have private liquidators and resolution professionals. Now, a thought came when it was coming in, where do people have the expertise to actually manage the liquidation of a company? But then you had the IBDA, it came with the rules, you have people registering, and now a lot of these liquidations are running very well. So therefore, if really this comes into effect, what we'll have to look at, and we have quite a few formidable institutions in India. In fact, if you look at the Sri Krishna report, he has named 35 institutions, of which he will specifically refer to at least 7 or 8, saying that they're more than capable of doing this, and therefore we are entrusting them with this work. So yes, I think we do have competent institutions, but all of these institutions will need to ramp up a bit to meet this requirement as and when it comes into force. Thank you. I'm done, Mr. Sir. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Desai, your
no, I think at least on this point, I don't have too much of conflicting view from Mr. Murari. I think again, if institutional regime or strengthening the institutional regime is a problem, then let's address that rather than try and solve it by bringing back everything to the courts, right? As I said, if that is the headache that we are facing, then let's address that, rather than try and, use any other way to address that problem. So I think if I agree, till now we have not focused on the institutional regime. In fact, 2019 high-powered committee was named in a way, or the title of the committee was to institutionalize arbitration in India. That was the objective and the focus. We just have to continue going that route. And that's why I'm bringing back the aspect of slicing the cake between ad hoc and institutional versus domestic and international commercial arbitration, because that is what was intended as part of the high-powered committee, which was set up in 2019, and what it finally, took a shape of. So I think, in short, subject to further time, I can elaborate on these points. But in short, I think, focus on strengthening the institutional arbitration regime in India, do whatever is required to support that regime. And to answer Mr. Murari's point, yes, under Section 11, the limited powers are only for appointment. Thereafter, you can go back to ad hoc or anything else what you have agreed for. And it is not compulsory for the parties to continue with that institution under their rules for the full conduct of arbitration. So I think, I would, take a pause here, before, we really run out of time. If we want to answer some of the questions from the audience, we can take it at this juncture. Or Amit, you may, moderate in whatever best way you want to, as we go forward.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Desai. So I think, as you rightly put it, I think that sort of concludes the substantive portion of the exchange that we've had with the speakers. But I mean, the hallmark, I guess, of a proper debate or discussion is that we also engage with the questions which the audience might have in mind. So I think one question from Mr. Krishnamurthy, which I thought was quite relevant, and it's something, in fact, which I wanted to even otherwise have views on from the speakers, is that after the 2019 amendment to Section 29A, once you lodge an application before the court, effectively the mandate of the tribunal can then continue till the court takes a final view of the matter. So one of the questions which routinely comes up, and one with Mr. Krishnamurthy is articulated here, is as to what happens if one of the parties refuses to attend the proceedings in the meantime, and a related issue as to whether how fair is it to ask a party which is strenuously contesting the extension before the High Court to, in the interregnum, appear before the tribunal and make that requisite, let's say, engagement with the tribunal in the meantime.
So if I may take it first, or Mr. Murari, you may want to.
Please.
I think continuation with the arbitral proceedings, in my view, is no different than, continuing with the arbitration proceeding of a respondent who may not want to even start the arbitration in the first place, right? I think if the party decides not to appear on this ground, it is no different than party not appearing on the ground of jurisdiction or any other reason for which the party may want to delay the process. I think the answers would be the same as arbitrator would deal with in any other circumstances. So I don't think it is different in any other way. On the aspect as to how fair it is, I think it is only an interregnum. It is only a taking care of a situation of a time between application is made and the application is taken care of, and if that is the only time that is included as part of that process, I really don't see that it is so unfair on one side. So if everything we see in India from a relief perspective is on balance of convenience and what prejudice it caused from one to another, right? You will have to always balance it. Who will be more prejudiced? Where is the balance of convenience? I really don't see that balance of convenience is in favor of somebody trying to shut the arbitration, even for that short period, versus the parties who may want to, at least convince the court that why arbitration should continue. So I would look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Mr. Vyapak said, because you're looking at it from a perspective of a party who has probably tried to delay the arbitration. vis-a-vis the perspective of a party who's keen on the arbitration proceeding, but who has suffered because of the delay. And then you're saying go to court, make an application. Now, it's possible that the party would try to delay the arbitration, will also try to delay the court proceeding. And everything comes to a standstill for that time. So therefore, I think this was the bane of the 1940 Act, because you didn't have a provision like this, which meant if you went to court, the whole arbitration waits till the court decides it. This is the bane. So once they introduced this time limit, this was a necessary sequitur to that. So I would think it's a good provision. I would agree with you, Vyapak.
Right. So yes, I guess it's nice to see unequivocal agreement between both speakers. Right. So I think maybe the next question
that shows the fatigue.
Yes. Right. So I think on that note, maybe we can have one last question from the member of the audience, Mr. Harshal Agarwal, who asks a very pertinent query that Indian arbitral institutions so far seem to have demonstrated a certain reluctance in adopting online platforms to conduct the arbitration proceedings. So what do you believe are the reasons for this? And also, if at all they do move on to adopt these online resources, what are the practical benefits involved for all concerned, including the parties?
Again, I think Harshil was my colleague at ND earlier. So thanks, Harshil, for joining. And he is now a co-founder of a dispute resolution platform. So congratulations to him. If I am not wrong, he's the same Harshil. But I think the concern is right. And in this era of online dispute resolution, I think, obviously this is possibly one way to further proceed so far as certain kind of disputes are concerned. I think if I may draw an analogy again, even a government agency like income tax are looking at faceless, arbitration, faceless dispute resolution. They may not be online dispute resolution that direction, though there may be people behind that looking at it.
Did we lose the It's an oral decision.
Yeah, I think the internet connection at Mr. Desai's place is also showing fatigue. So there seems to be a small connectivity problem. So I think by the time Mr. Desai possibly reconnects, may I request Murari sir if he has any comments to make in the
I'll just chip in till Mr. Desai comes back. I may not basically agree with the question that arbitral institutions are reluctant to offer online dispute resolution courses, because I'm associated with the Nani Palkiwala Arbitration Center, and we've been trying with great distinct to promote, especially during the COVID times. We have tried to keep arbitration proceedings going by offering online dispute resolution. We've tied up with several institutions for this purpose. On the contrary, we find that there is some reluctance in parties in doing that, especially in the matter of recording of evidence. They would prefer to do a physical recording of evidence. And they say, maybe if it's our arguments, we may agree for it. Some arbitrators have also said that they're not technically qualified enough to sit and understand all that's required in an online dispute resolution. So that seems to be more of a constraint rather than what the institution can offer, because the constraint is A, from parties, and B, from some of the arbitrators. Some of them are very tech savvy, but from there, some who aren't, there seems to be some kind of, that would be.
Sorry, I got disconnected, but I hope Mr. Murari answered that question. But I think last point I was trying to say is that, look, online dispute resolution is here and it will continue. It's a question of how technology develops and how the comfort and confidence, as the 2 C's we call it in an arbitration process. One may have comfort to it, but not confidence that it can deliver results. I think as the technology move forward in this direction, I think it is going to be something which is going to be adopted more and more, as we have seen even in certain government related disputes like income tax and all. So we'll see this more and more in arbitration.
Right. So I think on that note of confidence in relation to online dispute resolution, I would like to once again thank both the speakers for having shed light on both of these very contemporary and relevant and important areas of debate in the arbitration legal ecosystem of the country today. And with that, I would hand over the stage to Mr. Soni for the concluding address. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Amit.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Mr. Vyapak.
Thank you, Mr. Murari. And this was, in all fairness, this was just done for the debate purpose. Otherwise, please pardon me if I went little beyond my scope.
Not at all. Very interesting, and you'll have to pardon me because I was given an opposite position, so I had to take it.
I would request both speakers to pardon me by treating me at the appropriate juncture.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone, and thanks Amit for a beautiful kind of moderation of the esteemed panel. Thanks Mr. Murari Raghavan and Mr. Vyapak Desai. I think it was an engaging discussion on the impact of both Section 11, Section 29, and facilitated by Dr. Amit George. I guess a lot of perspectives came in, and he helped segue the discussion from Section 29 to Section 29 to 11. And it was intriguing 1 hour plus of discussions followed by a series of questions and quite a lot of perspectives, which we think will be very useful for all of us working together. So this brings us to an end of the second in the series of webinars organized by Just Act and FCDR. Thanks very especially due to FCDR for the pioneering work that they're doing, especially Chitra for envisioning this series and kind of holding the series of the webinars together. Also to everyone who's spared their time attending the webinar. We look forward to welcoming you soon to the next in the series again. So thanks to the panelists, thanks to Dr. Amit George, thanks everyone again, and look forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shepard. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr.